Boker Tov, Girin. Ma shlomchem. Oh, that's a good solid. Well done. Okay. No one said Ra or no one said Tov Me'od either, except I thought Kempis might with a daughter, a new daughter. Now that's child number 4, isn't it? And do you know the Hebrew word for 4 now? Put you on the spot. Arba'ah. Arba'ah. Okay, very good. Keep you on your toes there. All right. All right, we want to do several things today. One is to go back to chapter 16 and go over that with you. You did the exercises for it, but I want to make certain that we have properly understood all the things that you need to know. The imperfect and the imperative are very significant for your Hebrew knowledge, and it's something we just cannot neglect. The imperfect by itself is found more times than any other verb form in the Old Testament. So it's something that if you don't understand or you don't get why we call it a prefix conjugation, you'll have problems from now on. So it's very, very important that we get this one down. So let's take a look at it now. As we look at the imperfect, first of all, it has been traditionally called the verb form that shows that something is incomplete or moving toward completion. Now that is not a correct view of the imperfect. It may, in some cases, refer to something that is incomplete, but it is not always incomplete. In fact, we could argue that incompletion comprises less than half of all the usages of the imperfect. So we must be very, very careful and cautious here. It's not adequate for us to say, well, the imperfect means incomplete, the perfect means complete or completed. We cannot say that for either one of these. And so as we go through, I'll be emphasizing this and also helping you out with regard to translation. I was very pleased to see that some of you are feeling free enough to try future and present tense and not just past tense with perfects in your translations. And that some of you are feeling also free to use past tense for an imperfect in translation. We've asked you to normally translate the perfect as a past and normally to translate the imperfect as a future, just so that those of us who are doing the grading know that you have properly identified the verb form. But if you do that religiously, the sentences won't make much sense. There'll be times you look at it and say, this just is awkward. Did I miss something here? And that's because of that kind of restriction. So when you feel that it's overly restricted and it doesn't make sense when you translate the perfect as a past and the imperfect as a future, try a different tense with it and work it out. And as we go through that, I'm going to be flexible with you as you experiment. But we've had enough now that I think I can tell, since I've graded number 16, exercise 16 already, that I know that most of you recognize the difference between a perfect and an imperfect. You notice the forms. We'll be doing some parsing later, and you'll have parsing exercises, and we'll reinforce that again. But as of today, I want you not to restrict yourselves to translating perfects as past and imperfects as futures. Okay? I want you to get more flexible with it so that you have a smoother translation and that you have a better understanding of the verb. We just did that temporarily just to try to do that. Now, the imperfect really has to do with reality. It's the idea of a subject or object or circumstances that are more prominent than the action itself. That's because, remember, that the word order in Hebrew is verb first, and then we have the subject, and then the object, which some of you are still having problems with when you're translating from English into Hebrew. You keep trying to change it around and put it in the same order as English. You need to try to put it in the same order as the Hebrew. But as we're looking at that, and we see it, notice that the verb is normally first. But if we have an imperfect form of the verb, such as yishmor, He kept, he will keep, he keeps. As we look at that, notice that we have on that verb a prefix, that yod prefix. And that yod prefix tells you that it has to be a third person. It has to be a third person. It'll be a third person singular or a third person plural. If it's a third person plural, you'll have a suffix that will tell you. But if you have a tau prefix, that tells you second person normally, except for third person feminine singular. And if you have a noon prefix, that tells you first common plural. And if you have an olive prefix, that's always first common singular. So the yod tells you the person that you can expect. So the person, or the subject of the verb, is attached on the front of the verb, which violates this order because it's actually putting the subject ahead of the verb. Here's the verb here, and this is the subject indicator, the prefix. And so since the subject is being indicated prior to the verb in this verb form, then it tells us that there's something other than the pure action of the verb that has our attention or should have our attention. And it can be a number of things. It can be on the subject by context. It can be on the object. It can be on circumstances. Or it can be on the nature of the action itself, because the imperfect looks at the internality of the action. And here's what we're talking about here, the normal word order. And as we try to look at this verb, we find the imperfect has a wide range of usages. It's the most difficult verb to pin down for usage because it can also take upon itself various moods. For example, the subjunctive mood, what we call the jussive in Hebrew. He would keep, he should keep, he could keep, he may keep, he might keep. All of those can be involved in this verb meaning, and that's to be determined by context, not by form. The same as the tense is determined by context and not by form. So all this does is signal that there's something other than the action of the verb itself that is the focus, or it's the kind of action, or it's the mood of the action, and all that has to be determined by context. And only context will tell you. There are very few forms in the imperfect that are what we call shortened forms that help you to identify them as being a modal form, a mood form of the verb. The focus in the imperfect is on the internal progress of the action. If the focus is on the action, it's on the internal progress of the action. By that, it's whether the action is beginning, he began to keep, or it's repeated, he repeatedly kept, or it is continuous, he is continually keeping, or it is culminative, he ultimately or he finally kept. You see? So those things can be involved as well. Again, I'll repeat it. The imperfect is the broadest used verb, the widest usage of any verb in the Hebrew. It has many, many different facets, many, many potential meanings and uses. And context is going to be your friend in this, not your enemy. You have to depend on context very, very heavily. Now, that is a detriment then to doing the workbook exercises, because in the workbook you do not have sufficient context in most cases to be able to make every determination accurately. Once you see the sentences in their individual contexts, you might choose to translate them very differently than you have done in the exercises themselves. And what I'll attempt to do at times is to give you some direction on that as we look at it, sometimes prior to your doing the exercise and sometimes after you've done the exercise, to discuss with you what the context contributes to the things and why I would translate a little bit differently. But I'll never take away points on the basis of a lack of context. I will look at the legitimacy of your text as you read it with what you have and allow certain flexibility in that. So keep this in mind. Remember, the perfect looked at the action from the outside, looked at it as a whole, without regard to the internal progress of the action. Just as a simple fact that something was done. That's all the perfect did. And that's very simple. The perfect is the simplest of the verb forms to determine that way. But the imperfect, oh, what a world has opened up. We've got different kinds of action, we've got different kinds of mood, we've got different focuses that it can bring to the sentence, different emphases that it might draw our attention to. There's so much involved that it's difficult to tell all of it. So we have the repeated, the habitual, the in progress, the completed. All of those are different types of action that the imperfect might have in a context. And again, context determines it. Modal nuances, the subjunctive, what we call the jussive, the time, all this determined by context. You'll hear me say it over and over again, especially next semester, and then in OT 603, Introduction to Hebrew Exegesis. In Hebrew, it's context, context, context. It's like in real estate. Location, location, location. All right? It's the same thing in Hebrew. Context is the 500-pound gorilla that rules the roost and drives the meaning of what you translate. So watch that very carefully. Now, let's talk about the forms of the verb. First of all, using shamer as the example, remember in Hebrew we have a triliteral root, means 3 letters. The roots are normally 3 letters. There are quadriliteral roots, 4-letter roots that exist. There are even 5-letter roots. Most of those are borrowed from other languages, like Persian, for example, or Aramaic. But when we look at these roots, keep in mind we're looking normally for 3 consonants that form the main root. Then everything that's added to it, whether it's on the end, as in the perfect, or whether it's on the beginning, as in the imperfect, these help us to identify the person, number, and gender, and the type of verb that we're looking at. The imperfect is a prefix conjugation, so the prefixes are very important. So here with Yishmor, we have a yod prefix, third masculine singular, he will keep. Third feminine singular changes that yod to a tau. It becomes a tau, tishmor, she will keep. The second masculine singular is identical in form. So when you see tishmor and you're asked to parse it, and it's not in a sentence, it's isolated and by itself, you have to give both parsings. It is third feminine or second masculine singular. You'd have to supply that, you'd have to identify it. Context in translation would identify which it is. The second feminine singular is tishmari. Tishmari. 2 schwas in the middle of the verb means the first one is silent, the second one is vocal. Tishmari. You will keep. First common singular, notice the aleph prefix, just like we have on anoki and ani. I will keep. Eshmor. Okay, let's read these 5 forms together, okay? Yishmor. Yishmor. Tishmor. 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 Tishmari. Tishmari. Eshmor. Eshmor. And then we move to the plural. Notice that in the singular, there was only one that had a suffix. In the singular, only one had a suffix. That was the second feminine singular. The others have no suffix. It's only by prefix that it's identified. But in the plural, notice that the shurik occurs. In the third masculine plural, we have yishmeru. Third feminine plural, tishmorna. It's the one that becomes very, very different. The very different forms are the feminine forms. In the singular, only the feminine second person has a suffix. In the plural, we have tishmorna used twice, but both of them feminine. Tishmeru is the second masculine plural, you will keep. Tishmorna, you will keep. Notice that tishmorna has 2 parsings. So if you have it in isolation, in a parsing exercise, you would say that tishmorna is third feminine or second feminine plural. Okay? The imperfect third feminine or second feminine plural, tishmorna. And the first common plural, nishmor, should be a noon prefix on there. All right, let's read these together. Yishmeru. Yishmeru. Tishmorna. Tishmorna. Tishmeru. Tishmeru. Tishmorna. Tishmorna. Nishmor. Nishmor. All right. We'll let that sit for now. Moods. the cohortative is always in the first person. When we talk about moods, we've got three moods to talk about: cohortative, imperative, and jussive. And therefore the three different persons. Cohortative is always first person. The imperative is always second person. And the jussive is always third person. It can be singular or plural, but it's got to be person. So the cohortative is the first person. I will keep. Eshmerah. Notice the comet's hey that is used. The comet's hey is not always used. It can have the idea of determination. I will keep is the idea. It's not just a simple future. It's the idea of determination. I will keep. Let me keep. Be the same form, but by context be an idea of permission. I want to keep. That's by desire. That's desire. Again, by context. I may keep. That could indicate your own volition, or it could indicate the idea of potentiality. We will keep, and you do the same thing in the plural. We will keep, meaning we determine to keep. Let us keep. We want to keep. We may keep. Those are all legitimate translations of the cohortative. And again, you choose which one by context. Context is what determines it. Okay? John, question?
The cohortative is always first person. Is a first person imperative or imperfect always cohortative?
No. The first person imperfect is not always cohortative. Cohortative will be determined by having a comet's hey on the end of your first person imperfect, or by a na attached at the end. For example, we'd have here Eshmor na. That would also indicate a cohortative. But it can occur as just Eshmor and be determined by context, or Nishmor, the plural, and determined by context. But the cohortative idea is a minority of the first person imperfects. The majority of them will be just a simple verb. I keep, I will keep, I have kept, or whatever. But the cohortative is determined either by form, a comet's hey on the end, a na on the end, or just by context. Okay? All right? Everyone understand this? The cohortative has to do with first person only. First person only. It can be singular, it can be plural. Now, let's move to the third person. The third person is what we call jussive. That's what we learned in the Greek as subjunctive. Subjunctive. In the Hebrew, we just call it jussive. They are exactly the same. Subjunctive or jussive are identical. It's the same meaning. All right? In Hebrew, we've used a different terminology. Don't ask me why. Sometimes I think the individual languages, in an attempt to be different, develop and invent a totally different terminology just to confuse everyone and to make certain that you're speaking the same language, you're talking about the same language. So these are found only in the third person. So you can have a permissive idea, permission, let him keep. It can also be a mild decree, like let light come to be. When God says that, it's a jussive form. And it can be a decree, but if it's person speaking, it can be a mild decree. He may, should, could, would, might keep. Those are all possible. Let her keep, when you have a third person feminine singular, has all the same things. The plural, let them keep. Let them keep. She may keep. She should. She could. She would. She might. They may. They should. They could. They would. They might. All are potential. Okay? All of these can be involved. How do you determine again? Context. The form does not tell you which of these translations to choose. Context and context alone tells you which translation to use. So the third person is jussive. What's the first person called? Cohortative. What's the third person called? Jussive. And then we have the imperative in the second person. What you do is the imperative is formed on the basis of the imperfect. And this is true in the cow, in the nifal, in the hifil, the hafal, the piel, the pual, and the hithpael. It's across the board. All imperatives are formed on the basis of an imperfect form in each of those stems. So we take the cow. We have second masculine singular as tishmor. We take that tau off, and we have shamor. That is the masculine singular imperative. All you do is remove the prefix. Just remove the prefix, and you have the imperative. Keep. Now notice, when I gave the parsing there, ms, I don't put two ms. On the imperative, you never have to indicate the person. On the imperative, you never have to indicate the person. Everyone knows imperatives are second person. Take the second feminine singular, tishmari in the cow, take off the tau, and it creates a problem for us. What's the problem? Two schwas cannot stand together at the beginning of a word. So what do we normally do? The first schwa becomes a hirik. So that ends up with shimri. Shimri. All right? So that's how we form the feminine singular, keep. The plural, the same way. Tishmaru is the second masculine plural of the imperfect in the cow. We take off the tau. We have the same problem with two schwas. Make the first one into a hirik. And then we have the form of the masculine plural imperative. Feminine plural, tishmorna. Take the tau off. The initial schwa is not a problem. Shemorna, keep. All right? So you can figure out what the imperative is for any of the 7 different stems of the Hebrew verb just by looking at the imperfect of the second person. Take off the prefix. And if you end up with 2 schwas in a row, change the first one to a hirik. That's it. That's all there is. That's all that's involved in it. This is another reason why we say that the imperfect is so significant and so important, because it is also directly related to the imperative. The 2 verb forms that are most closely related are the imperfect and the imperative, because they are identical in form except for that prefix. The prefix is taken off in the imperative. Everyone understand that now? It's the easiest way to remember the imperative. Just take off the prefix on the imperfects of the second person, and you have the imperative form. Let's read these together. Shemor.
Shemor.
Shimri.
Shimri.
Shimru.
Shimru.
Shemorna.
Shemorna.
Now, negatives. When we have a negative of an imperative, a prohibition, you shall not, or you must not, or never do this, lo is the negative to be used. We'll talk a little bit about al. Use lo. It is the negative for the imperative. Do not keep, never keep, lo shemor. Lo shemor. Feminine singular, lo shemri. Masculine plural, lo shemru. Feminine plural, lo shemorna. Okay, these are the 10 commandments are given. The negative ones are given with lo. Why? It is what we call the objective permanent negative. Lo is the objective permanent negative. In many contexts, it has the idea of never. It is that permanent. For example, in the Hebrew, when Joshua in chapter 1 is saying, do not be afraid, he does not use lo, because he's not saying never be afraid in any situation. He's talking about not being afraid in a certain situation or a certain classification of situations. And therefore, he will use the other negative, because the other negative, al, is what we call the subjective imperative. is the subjective, temporary imperative. Yes, John.
In the book on 110, it says that when you use low and negative, use it with imperfect.
Yes, normally use it with an imperfect.
So, but those are imperatives.
Here I have imperative used, and you can have it as well, but normally you would have imperfects here. It'd be lo yishmor, lo tishmari, lo tishmaru, and lo tishmorna. Correct. Yes, but it'll be primarily the imperfect. Here again, I think I was doing this after I had the problems at the hospital, and I can see that I didn't put it in here the way I should have. You can find it with the negative, with the imperatives, but it'll normally be with the imperfect. Thanks for noticing that. I'll have to correct that as well on here and get it done. Okay? Thanks for pointing it out. These have the idea of never keep. The negative with al, and here again it should be the imperfect is used because al is never used with the imperative. Al is never used with the imperative. Al is used only with the imperfect. So it'd be al yishmor, or al tishmor here, al tishmor, and al tishmari, and al tishmaru, and al tishmorna. These all have the idea of don't do this in this circumstance or this situation. It is a subjective. Don't keep this time or in this situation. All right, let's take a look at a few examples. Exodus 12:46. What etzem? What do you recognize from this? You recognize the and, right? Tom said that right away back there at the back. All right. Who knows what etzem means from your vocabulary? Bone. Bone. Franz had it there. Okay, bone. And a bone, lo tishbaruvo. What's shavar mean? Break. Okay, so it's saying a bone you shall not break in it. Okay, the idea is never, and never break a bone of it. It has to do with the Passover lamb. The Passover lamb. Not a bone is to be broken on the Passover lamb. All right, and never break a bone of it. The low, the negative, is what's here. Now notice that in this case, the bone, the direct object is placed first. That's for emphasis. That's for emphasis. And it's the idea of the focus here has to do with the bone. And so it's put first for that. That's not the normal Hebrew order. And the reason for it being out of the normal Hebrew order is to bring a focus on bone. Now in the context, and I'd have to look at the entire context to see, sometimes it's what we call a disjunctive clause, where you have a while plus a non-verb that indicates that this is a parenthetical statement or a contrast. And we'd have to look at the context to know exactly what that is. But for the time being, we know that etzem is the focus. Etzem is the focus. Okay? Now notice that when lo is used with an imperfect, the negative precedes, it is part of the circumstance. The negative is never put after the verb. The negative is always put before the verb. Always before the verb. Okay. Exodus 20 verse 18. Kenny, what do you recognize here?
Love.
What do you recognize?
Love.
I don't see lo there. Okay, al. All right. The negative al. All right, who recognizes something else here? Okay, judgments, mishpate, but what about the him suffix? There, T-H-E-I-R, their judgments. The wow plus the F will be the direct object marker, and their judgments, al tishmoru. This is because of the athnak, otherwise be tishmaru. When you have a verb in pause like this, it oftentimes changes it back to the original holum that we have, like in yishmor, tishmor, nishmor, eshmor, when we saw the holum. So when you have the verb in pause, a major accent like the athnak in the middle of a verse or the last word of a verse, sometimes that holum will come back up. That's just an unusual form. It's different than what's normal, but that's what occurs. All right? So what does this mean then, putting it all together? Anyone? Tom?
And the judgments they did not keep?
Notice that tishmoru is second masculine plural. You, plural. You, plural. Do not keep. Ought not to keep. Now, it's not the emphatic negative, notice. It's not the objective. So it means in this particular situation, or at this time, do not keep their judgments. In this context, it's probably having to do with their ordinances or some of their cultural aspects. Okay? And do not at this time keep their ordinances. Ezekiel 20, verse 8. Now, one other thing. The paragogic he, comet's he, actually, the comet's he. It's called paragogic because it's placed alongside of, placed at the end. You'll see it on imperatives. For example, in Psalm 17:1, we have Shema, Yahweh Tzedek. Okay? What is that? That's not a feminine. Remember, the feminine would be what? Shema-i is the feminine singular. Shema-orna would be the plural. This comet's he is placed on here to give a sense of urgency. Listen, hear that Yahweh is righteous, or hear a righteous cause. Context will determine which of the meanings is correct. O Yahweh, hear, O Yahweh, a righteous cause, or hear that that Yahweh is righteous. Psalm 25:20, Shamra. Notice here we have, instead of a schwa at the beginning that we would expect, remember that if this is a masculine singular, it'd be shamor. But if we add a comet's he, we can't say shamora. And so the holum is dropped, a schwa is placed in there, the ah is there, and we have to then supply a longer form of the vowel for the first letter. So it becomes shamara. Shamara. It almost looks like the Cal perfect third feminine singular. Okay? And here it has the idea of, O my soul, keep. Or it can be taken as guard my soul, with my soul being the object. You can't tell here except by context because eth is not used. Eth is not used very often in poetry. It's one of the characteristics of Hebrew that are left out most of the time in poetry. All right? Next thing I want you to do is look at exercise 17 in your books. Exercise 17 will be due on Thursday. I want to go over it with you here. You have two charts to fill in. You're given the verb root, and then you're to give the participle parts here. Like on akal, the masculine singular would be okale, okale. And you'll see these charts also in your book in chapter 17. So all you have to do is keep that open and just follow the pattern that is given in your book in chapter 17. Akal becomes okale in the masculine singular, and just follow on down through and just add in there. And if you do each one, if you take the masculine singular, do all the verbs here in the masculine singular. Okay? And then in the next, do the feminine singular, and then the alternative feminine singular. Because remember that the feminine singular has two different forms. It has an F suffix or an A suffix. Both are found. So you must give both. The alternate form is always the F Okay, the alternate form is always the F. If you go back to page 113, the beginning of chapter 17, your textbook, notice it says there, feminine singular, shomra or shomeret. Shomeret. The shomeret is the alternative. When you have yashav, you have yoshva is the normal form of the feminine singular. Yoshevet is the alternative form. Okay? So all you're doing is taking that chart that you have on the bottom, page 113, and you're plugging in the forms for all the verbs, those 5 verbs you have in chart A in exercise 17. Okay, everyone got that? And where it says ALT period after the feminine singular, that's the F. That's the F form. That's the alternative, not the A form. The A form is the normal form. All right? And then you go over to page 115, and you have another chart. These are the cal passive participles, the passive participles. Shamur. Notice it has a comets and a shurik. Shamur. Then you go to chart B in the exercises, and you fill in all of those on the basis of the chart on page 115. Notice that in the chart, we've given only the normal feminine singular form. We've left it to you to put in the alternative form. Try to put it in to the best of your ability. It is seldom used. It's one of the reasons we left it out. And that column is not going to be graded. You can put a mark above it right now. It will not be graded. The feminine singular alternative in chart B in the exercises will not be graded. I just want to see what you do with it. See how you look at your vowels and how you put them in, how you judge them on the basis of what you saw in the active back on page 113 for that F form, and just put those in. They are very, very, very rare in the Hebrew Bible for the passive participle. James.
On that chart, if the verb starts with the guttural, do you put a compound schwa underneath?
Absolutely. If it moves to a schwa, you change to a compound schwa. Remember, a simple schwa will not stay under a guttural. They prefer compound schwa. Okay? All right? And if you go through and look in the book, I believe in the examples that are given, there may be one. Did we give even one example? We didn't give a single example. Go to the back of your textbook. I don't think we gave you an example at all. So let's go back and let me give you one now. Go back to page 113 and look at your chart. And notice that we go to a schwa. Nowhere. All of them are holums on the main participle. So we have it only in the cal passive. Shemurim. Okay, let's take that as an example. On page 115, Shemurim, the cal the cal active participle masculine plural, or passive participle, excuse me. The cal passive participle masculine plural. Normally it'd be, remember in the singular, it's shamur. And in the plural it's going to change to shemurim. This is the third syllable back. Don't be confused by this little dot there. It's going to go to a schwa. So let's take amad as the root. And as you're looking at amad, in the active participle, you're always going to retain the holum. No matter what you do, you maintain the holum. So it's going to be in the singular there. But if we move to the passive, then you're going to have what? You're going to have amud. And then when you move to the plural, And let's just take out the consonants because that's all you're doing, is you're taking out the consonants. We have, this is the result. That simple schwa cannot remain under here. And so it's going to change to a hatif-pathic, emudim. Okay? Goes to a hatif-pathic. Remember that the gutturals prefer compound schwas and prefer A-class vowels. You stick with those, you're going to be 85 to 90% correct. Okay? Emudim. Everyone got that? It's only going to be in the passive where you have the problem. The active is no problem. It's going to maintain the holum. All right? Hatif-pathic, under the ayin, meme, shurik, daleth, hirik yod, final meme. Any questions? Now, two more things about participles. Participles are normally translated with ing when they are continuous in meaning. But participles have two possible meanings. Those meanings are either continuous or characteristic. When it's translated in the continuous, you use ing on the end. He was standing. All right? Or if you have omaid, same one. He is standing, he was standing, he will be standing. Tense determined by context. Ing is continuous. Characteristic, you use a present form. For example, participles will be used in such cases as if I look out the window and I see a horse outside, and the horse is eating grass. And if I say to you, look, the horse is eating grass. In Hebrew, we would use okeil, the kal active participle masculine singular. Okay? Hine, sus okeil. The horse, or hasus, the horse. Hine, behold, hasus okeil. And then you'd have the word for grass, which is esev, all right? So you'd be saying, Hine hasus okeil esev. Look, the horse is eating grass. But if I wanted to say, the horse eats grass, characteristically, not that he's doing it right now, but just to make a statement that it characteristically eats grass, in English, we use a present tense to say that. We say eats. In Hebrew, it's exactly the same thing I said before for continually eating. Context tells you the difference. For example, in Psalm 19, it's the heavens are declaring the glory of God, and the firmament is revealing his handiwork. How do we know those two participles in that verse are continuous? Because in the very next verse, the psalmist goes on to say, day after day and night after night. That tells us it's continuous, not characteristic. Context always tells you whether that participle is continuous or whether it is characteristic. But you wouldn't know it unless you know the context. Or unless you saw the horse and you see he's not eating right now, he's just standing there, then you know I'm not saying he is eating grass continually. It's the idea he eats grass. So context, what you see, what you hear, what you read determines which it is. But both are potential for the participle. All right, now, one other thing to take care of before we go too far. John.
In Hebrew, so you can use a participle in an independent clause, like without another verb.
Correct. The participle can be a verb all by itself. In fact, in modern Hebrew, the participle has taken the place of the perfect verb. Modern Hebrew rarely uses the perfect verb anymore. Everywhere where the perfect is used in biblical Hebrew, normally now the participle is being used in modern Hebrew. And that's whether it's present, past, or future. It doesn't matter. It's one of the differences between modern Hebrew and classical Hebrew. So yes, the participle can be used as the main verb in an independent clause. Correct. All right. I did not bring with me the schedule, but I believe that on our schedule we had lesson 17 exercise was going to be due either today or the last Thursday before Thanksgiving. On your schedule, exercise 17 is now due this Thursday. And we have a quiz, a vocab quiz, also on this Thursday. And it'd be the vocab quiz, I believe, number 9. And what do you have written down there for vocab quiz number 9? Which lessons does it cover? 15 and 16 for number 9. And did we already have that as actually number 8 this last time? Did we not? Okay. So then we're going to move on then to the next vocabulary quiz. And of course the numbers are all messed up here because of the changes. But we'll move on, I believe, lesson 17 and 18 for the next vocabulary. Is that right? What you have written down there? Okay, let's go over the vocabulary on 17 and 18 because these will be covered next week, or not the next class hour, not next week. So let's look at the end of chapter 17. Let's read the vocabulary together. We'll begin at the upper right and read across from right to left. The first one is nafal. Everyone?
Nafal.
He fell. Nafal is he fell. Please don't translate as to fall. Please don't translate as fell. Translate as he fell for the vocabulary quiz, okay? Nafal, he fell. Nata.
Nata.
He stretched out. Matzah.
Matzah.
He found. Tziwa.
Siwa.
He commanded. Ana.
Ana.
He answered. Sadeh.
Sadeh.
Field. Sadeh was used in one of your exercises, the field of Moab. Sadeh Moab. And that can be translated as the country or the region of. So Sadeh can have the meaning of more than just field. Put together with a proper name, it often means region. One of you translated it as the plain or plains of Moab. That is also legitimate, although it is somewhat rare that way. And you actually find that in the older English translations used there. Sadeh is field. Avad.
Avad.
He served. Avar.
Aver.
He passed over. Sar.
Ser.
Means official or leader. It's also the word that's used for prince. P-R-I-N-C-E. Prince. Like a prince of the people, a son of the king is Sar. Official, leader, or prince. Sha'ar.
Sha'ar.
Notice the accent above the sheen. That's the word for gate. It says the gate of a city. It's not the gate of a compound normally. It's not the gate going into a vineyard normally. It's usually referring to the gate of a city. Sha'ar. Gan.
Gan.
Garden, like in the Garden of Eden. Tawek.
Tawek.
Meaning midst. It's normally seen in the construct form tok, like in batok, in the midst of. In the midst of, batok. Shabbat.
Shabbat.
That's the word for Sabbath. Notice the dogish, the doubling dogish in the bait. Shabbat. Shavat.
Shavat.
Is the verb from which Shabbat is derived. He rested or he ceased. He stopped. And it's normally having to do with the stop work. Barak.
Barak.
He blessed. Mala'ak.
Mala'ak.
Messenger. Yalad.
Yalad.
He bore, he gave birth to, or he sired. Ga'al.
got out.
He redeemed. This is the word for redemption that has to do with family relationships. The kinsman redeemer, the goel, is derived from this verb. Ra, evil or bad. Etzba, finger. It's a feminine noun. Demut is feminine noun meaning pattern, form, shape, or image. Remember, we also had tselem, which means image. Na. Na is a particle of urgency quite often. We saw it also used with the cohortative. We'll find it used sometimes even with an imperative. It's not always possible to translate it. In some cases where you have an inferior speaking to a superior, such as a slave to his master or mistress, or a citizen to their king, you can translate na as please, a polite form, but it will not always be that way. Yes?
Should we put please if it's on the vocab quiz? Or?
You can put please on the vocab quiz, yes. You can put please on the vocab quiz, or you can just put in parentheses a particle of urgency. Either one. Be fully acceptable. Because many, many times you can't translate it. It's untranslatable. Yesod means foundation or a foundation wall or the base. A base of a wall or a base of a house or building. Yakol. He was able. This is not an infinitive absolute. This is a stative verb. There are several forms of stative verbs. One of them has the holum used in it in place of the pathak that we're used to seeing in verbs. He was able. Karen. Notice the accent on the first syllable. It's a feminine noun meaning horn. It's keranot in the plural, horns. Par. Means a young bull. Mabul means flood or deluge, and this is used in Scripture always of the Genesis flood, of the flood of Noah's day, the great flood, Mabul. Shafak. He poured out, he spilled, or he shed. Normally this is used of shedding blood. And then turn to page 120 at the end of chapter 18. And let's read that vocabulary. So these two vocabularies will be for the vocab quiz on Thursday. Even. You've often heard or used in perhaps a song, a hymn, Ebenezer, my Ebenezer. That's literally the stone of my help. The stone of my help. Ezer, help, Eben, stone. Eben is stone. It's a feminine noun. Boker. You're used to that. Boker tov, good morning. Boker means morning. Erev. Erev is evening. Ayil means a ram. Amma is a forearm, like from the fingertips to the elbow. That's your forearm. That's the amma. And that's also the length then of a cubit. A cubit. Usually 18 inches or a foot and a half approximately. So amma is a forearm or a cubit. Af is used of the nose, but it's also used as a word for anger. Some say that it's when you're angry, the nostrils flare. I don't know if that's true of people as much as it is of horses or animals. A bull, the nostrils flare when it's angry. And so it's come to symbolize anger. So that's why af is used for both nose and for anger. Beged. Beged means garment. If you have a beged, you're not neged. All right? All right? That's the way I remember it. Okay. Basar. Flesh. It can also be used of meat. M-E-A-T, the meat you eat. Helom. Excuse me, that should be with a guttural. Helom is dream, a dream, like Joseph dreamt many dreams. Helom. Shafak. This is given to you twice. It was also in the previous one. He poured out, he shed blood, or he spilled. Rava. He multiplied or he became many. Ma'od
Ma'od.
Exceedingly or very. Tov me'od, very good. Okay, me'od, very. Room. Room is a middle vowel verb, therefore it's always translated as an infinitive. So it's to be exalted, and in the perfect it is he was exalted, but that form will be ram in the perfect. We'll get to those verbs later on, but room is to be translated with the infinitive, to be exalted. Shatha, he drank. Avad, he perished. When you talk about Abaddon, Abaddon, that's the noun from Avad. Abaddon means destruction, annihilation. Avad, he perished. Chalam. Chalam is the verb for chalom, the noun. He dreamed a dream. Chalam chalom. All right? Batach, he trusted. Bean, to understand. Notice it's an infinitive form. To understand. It's a middle vowel verb. To understand. To understand. Bean. Not bane. Bane, a bait with a tseri yod nun means between. Bean means to understand. Bosh is another middle vowel verb. Bosh. To be ashamed. To be ashamed. The reason I have that we have the translation, he was ashamed in parenthesis, you'll notice that's given on all of these. That's just to tell you what it would be translated like if it were a perfect. But your lexical form is the infinitive. Now notice that shachat there does not have any vowels on it. That's because it never occurs in the kal, and so it's not shachat, it's actually shichet. When it occurs in the PL, but it never occurs in the third masculine singular. And so we just remember the root letters, the shin, chet, and tau. Means he ruined, he destroyed, he annihilated. Kavod. Glory, honor, weight, or heavy. And the last word, devash. Devash means honey. That has to do with the honey that you eat, not the honey you're married to. All right? Yes? There's no pronunciation given for it.
No pronunciation.
Right. That's why we don't have any vowels on it. If you wanted to supply a form that would be used, which does not occur anywhere in the Hebrew Bible, which is the reason we don't have anything there, it would be shichet. And we would normally put a asterisk beside it because it occurs nowhere in the Hebrew Bible. The reason that the hirik is not heightened to a tseri is because this is a strong guttural, the chet, which can be doubled by implication. And therefore the hirik doesn't change. All right, gentlemen, let's get started again. You'll notice on the screen I corrected these two slides where they should have had the imperfect forms instead of the imperative forms. You'll find the imperative at times with lo, but very rare. And this should be the form that's used. Why do I not have a dogish in the tau? Because the preceding word ends in an open syllable, lo. All right? So when you move to al, there is a dogish because the preceding word ended with a closed syllable, because it has a lamed. So keep that in mind, that your begad kafaf letters at the beginning of words have a dogish in them if the preceding word ended in a closed syllable. They do not have a dogish in them if the preceding word ended in an open syllable. So for some of you in your exercises, when you were talking about the sons of the prophet obeyed God, so you would begin that with Shama'u. Shama'u ends in a shurik, an open syllable, and so the sons of B'nai then would not have a dogish in the Beit because you have a shurik before it. And the prophet, Hanavi, and then at the end you had obeyed God, you could have put in the F there to indicate that it was the direct object, or it could be without it, but Elohim is the way it closes out. But the reason you do not have a dogish in this Beth is because it follows a word that ends in an open syllable. Everyone got that? Two other notes to remind you of, and in fact, I'm just going to go to that right now. I believe I've got it on here. All I needed to know about Hebrew I learned in 503. Okay? Because what you've learned in 503, even to this point, and we still have the infinitives to talk about, although you may have already read chapter 18 because of the schedule before I returned, but everything you've had up through chapter 18 is basically 90% of your Hebrew knowledge. Right there. And that's talking about Hebrew grammar knowledge, not vocabulary. All right, if we start talking about vocabulary, well, you're at 50% now, okay? If you want to add vocabulary into this. But all you need to know, what have you learned? The gutturals and their rules. What are the rules of the gutturals? They refuse doubling, prefer A-class vowels, prefer compound schwas. Those are very, very important. You learned about the major accents. What's the major accent that is the middle, the logical middle of a verse? Afnak. What closes a verse? Saluk plus the sof pasuk. Okay, the sof pasuk are the two diamonds at the end. The saluk is that vertical line that is used as an accent on the final accented syllable in a verse. Those are very important. The Zakef Katon and the Revia are also important, but the major accents are very significant and very important. The article is normally a hey with a pathak and a dogish forte in the following word, or in the following consonant. Okay? If that consonant is a guttural, what happens? It's rejected. It's rejected. If it's rejected totally, then you have to heighten that pathak to compensate. And there are a number of other possibilities as well, like ish, man, ha-ish. You heighten the pathak to a comments because the aleph rejects the doubling dogish. But then you have things like ha'am, where you have a comments, but you have a change in the word following it. You have ha'aretz, where you have a change following it. You have a number of different rules. You have the he'anan, that you have a segol in the article. There's various kinds of things, but this is the main one. And this is the one you have to keep remembering. Adjectives agree with their nouns. What do they agree with their nouns in? Three areas they agree with the nouns. What are they? Number, gender, and definiteness. Number, gender, and definiteness. You have to remember that. Look at your exercise for 17, exercise 17. And as you go down through that, those 5 translations you have on the back of that exercise, the back of the sheet, if you look down at number 5, you're reading across there, you have Sheshet Yamim Ta'avod Uvayom Hashiv'i Tishvot. Now, as you're looking at that, you have to keep certain things in mind. You have to look at it very carefully. Notice that you have a verb, ta'avod, but it doesn't look like tishmor. It doesn't have a hirik under it. Why doesn't it have a hirik under it? Why don't you have a hirik under the tau? We already covered it in these 4 points I've got up on the screen. You have a guttural. And that guttural has what under it? It has a hatif pathak, right? Because it prefers a compound schwa. Now, when you have that type of situation then, often the vowel preceding will be the same form, except the full form. So here, instead of a heroic, it changes to a pathac because the guttural prefers A-class vowels not only under it, but around it. And so the guttural answers your question there. The holum over the bait there, ta'avod, notice there's also a zakef katon accent. The holum tells you you're still in a cal imperfect, because that holum only occurs in the cal imperfect. And then you go on to vayom hashivai. What do we know about vayom? Tell me everything you know about it. Anyone? Give me one fact about it. Gus, did you say something? Or John? John.
So the and,
Okay, the and, the is and. Why is it
Because it's labial.
Because before a labial. The baith is a labial. All right? Why doesn't the baith have a dogish in it? Open vowel. The shurik is an open vowel. All right? What is the pathac under it? It's the article. Notice you also have the doubling dogish in the yod. All right? So you have in the. Okay? Everyone recognize the word yom? Day. All right? Now what about hashivai? It has a definite article. This is an adjective. And the adjective agrees with its noun in what? Definiteness, gender, and number. All right? So watch that as you're translating this. Now there's going to be one kicker here. And that is, there is one class of words in Hebrew that modify masculine nouns with a feminine adjective and modify feminine nouns with a masculine adjective. What class of word are we talking about? No? Numbers. Numbers. And that's specifically true when you're talking about the singular noun being modified, that occurs. All right? And it's in Numbers 1 through 10. Numbers 1 through 10. All right. Well, as you look at that, there's going to be different things there. The heroic yod on the end of hashivai is not a first common singular pronominal suffix. All right? It's very similar to what you saw in Canaani and Hivi and Hitti and Peruzi, Jebusi. Remember, those were the ites. Well, this can't have an ite on it, but it's very similar. All right? And then the last word there follows the cal very clearly, tishbot. And that is parsed the same as ta'avod. They're the same. The only difference in the forms is because of the guttural. Changes the form. That's all there is to it. Okay? Let's go on. Im, the heroic yod mem, at the end of a noun or end of a participle is the masculine plural. The is feminine singular. We have an alternative form in the participle. What's the alternative feminine form? Anyone? Eth at the end. Like, for example, the Hebrew name for the book of Ecclesiastes is Kohelet. Kohelet. Why? What you have there on Kohelet is a cal active participle based on the verb kahal. Kahal means he gathered, he congregated, or he assembled. And so we have Kohelet is the Hebrew name of the book of Ecclesiastes. It's a cal active participle feminine singular using the alternative ending. The alternative feminine singular ending. And how is that normally translated? The preacher. The preacher. All right? Kohelet means preacher. You say, well, why are they using a feminine for a preacher? All right? What does the Greek use for a prophet? Prophetes. It uses a feminine as well. Okay? So the feminine form, the reason for this is that the feminine form, like with the alternative F ending, in the cal active participle is often used for vocations. For vocations. All right? The oath ending is feminine plural. So we've had im, oath, alternative F for participles. Those endings are something you should recognize. The tsere yod at the end, like B'nai Yisrael, sons of Israel, meaning Israelites, is the masculine plural construct. At, like Torat Yahweh, the law of Yahweh, is feminine singular construct. So the tsere yod and the pathek tau. Word order. Normal word order is what? Begins with verb, then subject and object. Where do the modifiers go? Modifiers normally go after the word they modify. For example, adjectives go after the noun they modify, not in front of them. They go after. They follow. On one of the exercises you had, from the tent, Sarah heard the words of the men who spoke to Abraham. And some of you sat there and said, where in the world do I put this? And some of you put me ha-ohel from the tent, you put in front of the asher, the which, the relative clause. Don't do that. Asher clauses are adjectival in nature and they modify nouns. The asher clause must always go after the noun it modifies. Asher clauses always go after the noun that it modifies. And it's not the tent which in that context. So you have two places to put it. You can put me ha-ohel at the beginning of your sentence, or you can put it immediately after the verb. Immediately after the verb. Shama'a me ha-ohel Sarah. Okay, they normally go immediately following what they modify. In that case, you could have put it two different places. You'll note if you look carefully at that exercise, you didn't have any points taken off regardless of where you put me ha-ohel, unless you left off the article or unless you left off the min. All right, personal pronouns. Let's go through the personal pronouns. What's the personal pronoun for I? Ani or anoki. What's you masculine singular? Ata. What's you feminine singular? At. What is he? Who. What is she? He. All right, good. We got that. Remember, me is who, he is she, and who is he. All right? Strange thing, but you got to get used to it. All right? Now let's go to the plural. What's the plural? We. Nachnu or anachnu. All right? What's the plural second? What's the second masculine plural? Atem. What's the second feminine plural? Aten or atena, right? All right. What is the third masculine plural? Haim or hema. What is the feminine plural of the third person? Hain or haina. All right. Those are the personal pronouns. You need to remember those. Those are very important. The cal stem of all the forms, the perfect, the imperfect, the infinitives, the imperatives, and the participles. We've had all of them so far except what's in chapter 18 that we'll go over here in just a few minutes on the infinitives. You've had all these things. You also had all the names of all of the verb stems. What are the 7 verb stems? We begin with what? Cal. What's the passive of the cal? Nifal. What is the causative active? Hifil. What's the causative passive? Hafal. What is what we normally call intensive active? Piel. What is the passive? Pual. What is the reflexive intensive? Hithpael. See, you've had all those as well. When you have a wow with a pathic and a dogish in the following letter, this is something we have not discussed yet. We will. This is called wayiktol form of the verb. Let me put one up here for you. It's the imperfect, but it's a special imperfect. You take yishmor. He kept, he keeps, he will keep. Yishmor. If it is in a narrative context where we have a sequence of actions, then the Hebrew uses a special narrative form of the wow conjunction that has a pathic under it and puts a doubling dogish in the prefix letter of the imperfect. This is found only on imperfects. It's never found on any other form of the verb. If, for example, you have a first common singular, eshmor, I keep, I kept, I will keep. If we put the pathic here, we have the doubling dogish must be there. What happens with the doubling dogish? It's rejected by the aleph, the guttural, right? So what do we do? Anyone? What do you do if you have an article there? You show compensation. You heighten it for compensation. It becomes a comments. All right? Anytime you see a wow at the beginning of a word, and it will always be on the beginning of an imperfect, it will have an A-class vowel under it, a pathic if the prefix can be doubled, a comments if the prefix cannot be doubled, and the only prefix that cannot be doubled is the aleph of the first common singular. So that's the only place you're going to see this. It's when it's associated with this prefix that is first common singular. That form of the verb is called wayiktol, or it's called vayiktol in modern Hebrew. Why? If you take the shamer and instead put in katal, which was often the form that was used for verb paradigms, it would be pronounced wayiktol, or vayiktol for modern pronunciation. So that's the name of that verb. It's a narrative form of the verb that is used in narratives that emphasizes a sequence. And we will be introduced to that in detail later on, but it forms a huge part of Scripture. Look at all the texts that we have that are narrative. Genesis, Exodus, most parts of Leviticus, Numbers, parts of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles have narrative. We have narrative in the first chapter of Job. We have narrative in the last chapter of Job. We can go on and on. We have narrative within some of the prophetic books. So whenever you see this form, and it occurs very often in Scripture, it's the idea of a sequence of actions. And this is a special form that it takes to show that. And the context makes this past tense, because the context is talking about things that have already occurred. It's narrative history. And that form is called wayiktol. That's the one we haven't covered in any great detail. But you'll notice that we have now covered a large part of these things, and there's only that one that we haven't covered in any detail yet. The u is a plural suffix on verbs. When the u is on the end of verbs, it's a plural. When you have, and this, what happened is on my computer I have this automatic capitalization, and it wasn't turned off. That should not have a dogish in it. It should just be a wow with a schwa under it. I have to go back, and when I do that and type it, I need to hit a Control-Z to get it to undo. But that should just be a wow with a schwa. It's a simple conjunction. Notice the prepositions. The beith preposition, the kaf preposition, the lamed preposition, the min, meaning from, al, upon, over, against. Remember, al can mean against. Don't forget it. Remember, the lamed preposition can mean to as well as for. El, unto, and into. All right? Anyone got a guess at what this sentence says? It's the only thing left in Hebrew you haven't learned in 503 that's very important. Do you recognize a foe? Go ahead, Chad.
I recognize, I can't remember what it means though.
I thought you were going to say it. It means where. Where is Hashirutim? What's the most important question you need to ask often when you're traveling? Where's the bathroom? Okay, where's the loo? Okay, where's the water closet? Where's the restroom? Where's the toilet? Okay, Efo hashirutim is how you say that. That's the only thing that's important that you haven't learned yet. All right? But this completes everything. Notice there's only one thing there, and this is 90% of the grammar knowledge you need to read biblical Hebrew. And we've already covered it. That's why you're spending so much time now in translation, re-emphasizing the lessons you've learned, and learning vocabulary, and then learning to recognize some of these verbs that you've only heard about so far in their names, like the nifal, the hifil, the hafal, the piel, the pual, and the hithpael. We'll get to those. And how to handle things that have weaknesses, weak forms in verbs. How do we handle those? How do we repoint the middle vowel verbs that are so strange, that we translate as infinitives on vocabulary quizzes? Those things are yet to come. But you've had 90%. You can pick up a Hebrew Bible now, and you can turn anywhere in that Hebrew Bible, and there is 90% of the information, minus vocabulary, 90% of the information that's on that page in the Hebrew, you can already identify if you've learned the lessons well that you've had thus far. Okay? And the rest of it will come very quickly, and of course all the rest beyond that is really vocabulary, learning vocabulary. And that's why we have lexicons, to help make it easy, so you can use it to look up words that you don't remember and don't know. All right. Let's go to the infinitive. This is lesson 18, chapter 18. It's one you should have read or should be reading by Thursday, so we can go over it again on Thursday. And we're just going to very quickly begin it here. An infinitive usually is translated either as an ing word, which you're familiar with regard to participles, or a to verb. To rise, to stand, to be ashamed. So if you have an infinitive of shamer, the infinitive is going to be translated as keeping or to keep. The Hebrew has two infinitives. An infinitive construct. It's called construct because you can add endings to it, and you can put a prefix on it of a preposition. And it takes the prefixes and suffixes. The infinitive absolute takes absolutely nothing. It stands absolutely alone. The infinitive absolute is the purest form and the strongest form of the Hebrew verb possible in the Hebrew language, because it stands totally and absolutely alone. It has no prefixes, it has no suffixes. Its focus is purely on action and action alone, because it does not express gender, it does not express person, it does not express the nature of the action. It is pure action. All right? So the infinitive absolute stands absolutely alone, whereas the infinitive construct can be constructed with prefixes and suffixes. The prefixes are normally prepositions. The suffixes are normally pronominal suffixes. The infinitive construct, lishmor, there you have a lamed preposition on the front of it. To keep, keeping. Notice the form is identical to that of the imperative. The cal imperative, masculine singular, is identical in form to the infinitive construct. So when you learn how to form the masculine singular imperative, you've also learned how to form the infinitive construct, because they are identical in form. Context will tell you, and often it's because of that lamed on it that will tell you. Lishmor, to keep. F. Derek, the way to Eitz, the tree of life, Hachayim. Here, Derek is actually in construct with Eitz, to keep the way of the tree of life, literally, or to keep the way to the tree of life, out of Genesis chapter 3. The infinitive absolute has the form just like absolute. What's the first vowel in the word absolute? It's an A. What's the second vowel? O. Ab, A-B, so, S-O, okay, absolute. Keep that in mind because those are the vowels in the Hebrew infinitive absolute. Shamor, A-class vowel, O-class vowel. And the O-class vowel can be written fully or short. When we get involved in these, we get into what we call the CIA twins. And we'll just have just a minute here to cover it. CIA stands for cognate. The C for cognate. Cognate means related. It's related. Infinitive absolute. We have a pre-positive intensive, the PI twin. Shamor, and that for some reason the comments isn't on there. Oh, I know why. It's another thing I've got. I've got curly quotes turned on my computer. And so when I type the comments, it will become this accent if I don't put the Control Z in, and I didn't put it in. Typed it too fast and didn't look at it. Shamor Tishmarun. Notice they're both Shamor, Cal, infinitive absolute. Tishmarun is the Cal, imperfect. They're both from Shamer. That makes them cognate. They're from the same root. They're from the same root. The Shamor, infinitive absolute, precedes Tishmarun, the imperfect. Eth mitzot Yahweh Elohechem. And this is, you shall surely keep the commandments of Yahweh your God. The same form is found in you will certainly die. You will surely die. Mot tamut in Genesis chapter 2. All right? The other one is the PC, post-positive. And it's like this. You put the ekaltem is the cal, perfect. Second masculine plural of akal, followed by the cal infinitive absolute akol means, and you shall keep on eating. That's why it's post positive continuous. Post, after, positive, position. Pre-positive, before, pre, positive, position. So the shamor, the infinitive absolute before is intensive. The infinitive absolute following the cognate verb is continuous. We'll come back and cover that again. Go over it. It's very important. It has some very important sections of Scripture to look at in which this has a key meaning. It's exegetically significant.